All right, so buckle up, everybody, because today we are taking a deep dive into Pakistan's political scene.
Sounds intense.
Oh, it is. And we've got some seriously insightful source material to work with, straight from Newsi 24/7.
Ooh, one of my go-to podcasts.
Mine too. Specifically, we're looking at an episode of Talks of the Nation called The Current Political Climate in Pakistan, Crisis or Opportunity. Now, I gotta be honest, even for someone who keeps up with global affairs, this episode had me rethinking some assumptions.
Yeah, Pakistan's situation is one of those things that can seem simple from afar, but the closer you look.
The more complicated it gets, right? Which is exactly why we're diving in. So before we unpack all the details, let's define some terms. For you, when we talk about political instability in Pakistan's case, what are we really talking about?
Well, the broadcast expert, Omar Abbasi, had a great way of putting it. He called it a constant state of flux, which I think perfectly captures how unpredictable things can be over there. And that unpredictability, that's what really defines political instability in this context.
So it's not just about, dramatic coups or anything. It's that the ground rules are constantly shifting. Which makes me wonder, is this a recent thing for Pakistan? Or is there, a historical pattern we need to understand?
Oh, definitely a pattern. The podcast actually traces this instability back decades, showing how Pakistan has swung between civilian and military rule over and over again.
Whoa. So not just different leaders, but different systems entirely.
Exactly. And that makes building long-term governance, almost impossible.
Like trying to build a house on a foundation of, jelly or something.
A very wobbly jelly. And that leads to what the podcast calls a vicious cycle. Every new government comes in promising change, but they end up focusing on short-term wins to keep people happy instead of tackling those deep-rooted problems that need long-term solutions.
It's like putting a Band-Aid on a broken leg, right? Looks like you're doing something, but...
But the problem just gets worse underneath. Okay, so, pop quiz time. What do you think are some of the biggest challenges that keep Pakistan stuck in this cycle?
Well, based on what you said, I'd guess a lack of consistent policies has got to be up there.
Ding, ding, ding. You got it. Every time a new administration comes in, they often scrap what the previous one did, even if it was working. It's like starting a marathon, and every few miles, they move the finish line.
Talk about frustrating.
Totally. And on top of that, you've got the bureaucracy, which is super resistant to change.
Ah, yes. The infamous bureaucracy.
Pakistan's administrative system, it's very traditional, very hierarchical. Any attempt at reform is seen as a threat by those who benefit from the way things are now.
So even if you have good ideas, actually implementing them is
an uphill battle. The podcast is a great example of this. A few years back, there was a push to digitize land records in Punjab province. Seems like a good idea, right?
Yeah.
It helps prevent corruption, makes things more efficient.
Right, makes total sense.
But it faced huge pushback from the existing bureaucracy, who saw it as a direct threat to their power. The project basically stalled, showing just how deep this resistance goes.
Wow. So it's not just about having the will to change. It's about navigating these, entrenched systems.
Yeah.
Which makes me wonder, what does all this mean for everyday Pakistanis? How does this political instability actually affect people's lives?
Well, that's where the economic fallout comes in big time.
Makes sense. Who wants to invest in a country where the rules could change any minute?
Exactly. So both domestic and foreign investors get spooked, which leads to financial instability, a weaker currency.
And that trickles down and affects everything, right?
Everything, from job opportunities to the cost of basic goods.
It's like this ripple effect, and the people who are already struggling, they get hit the hardest.
Exactly. And what's even more concerning is this instability prevents Pakistan from dealing with some really urgent social issues. Things like poverty, education, healthcare, all get put on the back burner because the government is just trying to keep things from falling apart.
So it's not just a political problem, it's a human problem. These are real people whose lives are being directly impacted by this constant uncertainty.
Absolutely. The podcast does a fantastic job of highlighting that human cost, reminding us that there are millions of Pakistanis trying to build a better future, but this instability makes it that much harder.
Okay, so we've painted a pretty bleak picture here, but the title of this podcast episode mentions opportunity. So I'm hoping there's some reason for optimism.
Well, that's where things get really interesting. The podcast talks about how crisis can actually be a catalyst for change.
Oh, interesting. So when things are already a mess, people are more willing to try something new.
Exactly. There's less resistance to shaking things up. And the podcast points to this rise in civic engagement, especially among young Pakistanis. They're using technology to organize, raise awareness, hold their leaders accountable.
It's like they're bypassing their traditional power structures and creating their own avenues for change. I actually read about how Pakistani youth used social media during the 2010 floods.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, they were providing real-time info, coordinating relief efforts. It was amazing.
That's a perfect example. It shows how this generation, they're not just waiting for things to get better, they're making them better.
So how do we take all this energy, this momentum, and turn it into lasting change? Because enthusiasm is great, but you need a plan, right?
Right. And the podcast really emphasizes strengthening democratic institutions.
Okay, so like making sure the government actually works for the people.
Exactly. Omar Abbasi, the expert they interviewed, he talks about establishing a clear separation of powers.
Meaning like the different branches of government keep each other in check.
Yes. So no one entity has too much power, which helps prevent corruption and abuse of authority.
Makes sense. Checks and balances like we have here.
Exactly. And he also talks about electoral reforms, making sure elections are free and fair.
Because if people don't trust the system, why even bother voting?
Right. It undermines the whole idea of democracy. And beyond the institutional stuff, the podcast talks about investing in education and social services.
So giving people the tools they need to build a better life for themselves.
Exactly. Education, healthcare, economic opportunities, these are the foundations of a stable and prosperous society.
It's like you're planting seeds for the future.
Yeah.
Right? Giving people the resources to thrive.
Beautifully put. And I think that's where the podcast finds a bit of cautious optimism.
Cautious?
Yeah, they're not sugarcoating the challenges, but they also highlight the resilience of the Pakistani people.
Their ability to innovate, to adapt, to overcome.
Exactly. So going back to the title of the podcast, Crisis or Opportunity, it seems like the answer is...
Oh, both.
Both, huh? Pakistan's at a crossroads, but it also has the potential for a brighter future.
Like one path leads back to the same old cycle of instability, but the other path, the one less traveled.
That's the one that leads to a more just and equitable society. The question is, which path will Pakistan choose?
And that's a question we should all be asking ourselves, right? Not just about Pakistan, or about the world we want to live in. That's a really thought-provoking question. And, as I was listening to this podcast, I kept thinking about how easy it is to feel overwhelmed by all this. Like, what can one person really do to make a difference in a situation as complex as Pakistan's?
It's a common feeling for sure, but I think it's important to remember change happens on multiple levels.
Okay, so not just focusing on those big picture things, like what can we do as individuals?
Exactly. The podcast actually talks about the importance of informed engagement.
Like just staying aware of what's going on.
That's a great first step, following reliable news sources, having those tough conversations with friends and family, even supporting organizations working on the ground.
So even small actions can contribute to something bigger.
Absolutely. It's all about finding those points where your own skills and passions can have an impact.
Yeah.
You mentioned being interested in the role of technology in development.
Oh, yeah, definitely. And the podcast talked about that too, right?
They did. Remember the example of mobile banking helping women in rural areas gain financial independence?
That's right. I'd completely forgotten about that. That's such a powerful example of how technology can create real change.
It really is. And it shows how tech, when combined with grassroots activism, can be a force for good.
So even if we're not in Pakistan, we can still engage with this issue, learn more about it, and find ways to make a difference.
Absolutely. And remember, understanding Pakistan's political landscape isn't just about knowing the facts. It's about empathy.
Understanding that these are real people whose lives are being shaped by these forces.
Exactly. It's about approaching these issues with curiosity, with a willingness to learn, and with an open heart.
Because at the end of the day, we're all connected, right? What happens in Pakistan, it affects us all in some way.
Well said. The choices we make, the actions we take, they have ripple effects that extend far beyond our own borders.
And on that note, I think it's time to wrap up our deep dive into Pakistan's political scene. It's been a fascinating and honestly a pretty eye-opening journey.
I agree. It's a complex issue, but understanding it is crucial for all of us.
And to our listeners, we encourage you to continue exploring this topic. Keep learning, keep asking questions, and keep finding those opportunities to make a difference in the world. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.